Hello and welcome to another video about landscape photography. In this video we're gonna do something a little bit different. We're gonna look back to when I started with photography, so to the year 2008, 2009. And yeah, actually in 2009 I did my first real photography related road trip. I went to the Grand Canyon in the US, and in this video I will reveal some of the photos I took there. I show them to you, and yeah, those are a lot of, I think, bad photos, but I also have a few good ones. And yeah, we're gonna look at the photos and see what things I did wrong back then, what things I might already have done right in terms of photography, and yeah, try to extract some lessons from it, which might help you if you're starting with photography, or even if you're already doing photography for some time. Maybe there's something interesting we'll find. And also, if you just want to see some bad photos from me, yeah, stick around. We're gonna look at them though now. So let's start looking at some photos. Though the first stretch of photos I took, those were all taken kind of along the road. So I drove from Las Vegas up to the Grand Canyon and did a few stops just along the road, took some photos, and here I even tried some kind of a panoramic shot. And yeah, as you can see, I did many stops. I went along the Route 66, the historic one, did some experiments here, took photos, more photos, and this here actually is already the cleaned up version, so I just kept a few photos just as a memory. But kind of as a lesson, I should have maybe been a little more intentional with what I want to get out of such photos. Back then I really thought I take those photos now and they make it to my homepage or in my portfolio. But yeah, if that was my intention, I really should have known that the occasional roadside photo will never do it. Usually they don't make it into a portfolio. I never processed any of those photos, and yeah, just kept a few of them just as a personal memory. And I think that's perfectly fine. So if the intention was to take those photos for personal memory, just to document the trip, then this is a good intention, and definitely take those photos. So nowadays I take those with my cell phone. But yeah, just stopping alongside the road, quickly getting out the camera and trying to get a photo which ends up in a portfolio, that's seldom the case. I mean, there can be exceptions when the light's really nice and you happen to be in the perfect spot. You pull up the side of the road and grab the camera, take a photo. But yeah, you need a lot of luck. Here I think those photos not very good. I mean, this one looks kind of nice, but all the others is kind of just roadside snapshots. So really try to be intentional with what you want to achieve with your photos, and then also be selective. So now here I start with the photos from the Grand Canyon. So I arrived the first afternoon and yeah, directly went to the rim and yeah, started again taking photos. And I walked around, and what this looks like to me now, looking back at those photos, I mean, first of all, the light wasn't very good that day, but what I then did, even the light wasn't good, it's kind of spray and pray. So I kind of went along the rim, took many photos. Here I actually had some nice light, but the composition is rushed, also this one. So I went from one spot to the next, taking photos and hoping that there would be some photo which would be good, I guess. So I think that's what I did back then. And here the light again was quite poor, and I continued taking photos. So now I'd still do this today, but in another way and with another intention. So when I arrive at a place, I also walk around there, try to look at as many viewpoints as possible, and I also take photos, but with another intention. I would then basically look for the compositions which I want to shoot in better light, take a photo just for reference, so I could at another day, maybe the next day or 2 days later, I possibly have better light, take those photos, look at them and see where I want to go, which photos I now want to take with that light. But here, back then in 2009, it was just, as I said, spray and pray. So just taking photos, many photos, and hoping that one of those would be good, I guess. So now as we get to the first morning, I actually find a lesson here in those photos where I did something right, I think. So this morning there's also a little bit of experimenting, but it's not as bad as the day before where I just went around shooting as many photos as possible. But what I did this morning, I was patient. So here you see I find this composition, and I stuck with it, but with little variation. So first I set this up and knew this is a photo I want to get in best light. Then I did some teleshots here. I'm still at the same location, and those were kind of the right decision. Taking close-ups here with this light in the background works very well, but I'm still at the location waiting for the perfect moment to capture the composition which I found before, which happened just here, with the sun breaking through the storm clouds in the background and the light bathing the Grand Canyon here. This was just the perfect moment. Being patient, that's a lesson here. I'm glad I did it this morning, so I didn't rush around as the evening before or the afternoon before, just spraying and praying. Here I was intentional with what I wanted to capture. I did the scouting in the dark, I found this spot, and I kind of stuck with it. And also this, similar to the lesson which I had in another video about how to take great photos, and this resembles that. So this photo, I'll later show you the processed version of it, after more than 10 years, is still one of my favorites. Let's look at the photos I took that afternoon, and you see many of those photos I try to put some foreground in it. So not in those here, but if you look here, there's some rocks in the foreground. Then again, here, this one, it's kind of the parking lot. This one with the trees left and right, and yeah, here again, foreground. So what the lesson I extract from it is, you should be intentional with what you put as a foreground. So does it add to the scene, or does it rather distract from the important elements? You have to avoid elements in your foreground which are more intruders into your scene or block your scene and take away from what the image should be about. For example, this one here, I really tried hard to include some kind of foreground, but it's a lot of negative space down here, so it's in shade. It doesn't harmonize with the Grand Canyon here, which is in beautiful light. Also have this tree or branch intruding into the frame, so it doesn't really add to the scene. And also this one here, this tree, it blocks the view. So if this wasn't here, I think this could have been quite nice, but also still, it's very dark. So there's shade, and then I guess I tried to create a window here, or a composition which looks like a window looking out to the Grand Canyon, but didn't really work. So all those compositions which you see here with the foreground, for me now, they're compromise. And I also know a bit of the reason. Back then, I only had one lens, which was the 17 to 50 millimeter lens from Tamron. So I didn't have a wide angle lens, and yeah, composing with foreground with such a focal length, it's not very easy. And also if you just walk along the rim, it's hard to find a good foreground. And I still tried it, but really all of those photos, all of those foregrounds, they feel like a compromise. So they don't add to the scene. They're more a distraction for the viewer, and the better photos I got were really those where I didn't have a foreground at all. So let's look at some of them. For example, this one here, just focusing here on the light in the background. Then let's see, surely have a few more. Yeah, this one here, focusing here on the clouds and the view, and as the light bathes the background here. And I didn't try to include a foreground. And also this one, zooming in down here at the Grand Canyon, at the river here. So this was intentional, and yeah, leaving out any foreground. And those other photos with the foreground, it's more a compromise. And yeah, really, you don't always need a foreground. Another lesson which I can extract from some of the photos, for example, this one here, is I didn't really shoot or expose to the right. I have a few videos about this and the reasons why that's important, especially if you're shooting Canon. But here, as you see on the histogram, I still have a lot of space here. This was just a quick handheld shot, but I really should have checked the histogram afterwards. Back then I was shooting with a 40D. I'm not sure if this one had live histogram, but definitely after taking the photo, should have checked and adjusted the exposure here. So this one, I'm losing a lot of details here in the dark tones. So they are there, but if I want to pull up the darks, I'd surely get noise. And I did this for many of the photos. So let's look at this one, although it's a very bad photo, but this is so far to the left. I don't know what I was thinking. So at first, what did I want to compose here, and then why did I expose it so dark? So really the lesson, even if you're not shooting Canon, try to expose to the right, because you'll always gain quality for your photos. So the dark tones will be much cleaner, and yeah, you will have a lot more room to play in post-processing. Yeah, and from this lesson, let's directly move to the next lesson. So let's go to some photos which I took the next day. Let's just go here and find something where actually it seems I learned from my mistakes. So this one is still, I think, too far to the left. But then later this evening, what I started doing, I was doing actual bracketing of exposures. So I took a dark photo which contains all the details I have, and this one is actually, it's already composed very far to the right, so kind of a good exposure. But I took another one where I have really a lot more detail down here in the dark tones. Yeah, and I continue to do so a very dark and a very bright one and a middle exposure, just to get everything, because the dynamic range that evening with the dark clouds and the light hitting from the side here was quite big, and I actually started taking bracketing of exposures, and that was a very good decision. So this is one thing you should always do: take enough photos of a scene to gather all its details, to be able to later put everything together and post and get the perfect result. And also, going a little farther than just taking bracketed exposures, what I also do a lot these days is focus stacking, especially if you have a foreground, which I didn't manage so well during this trip. But if you have a good foreground, you want this foreground to be sharp, but you also want the background to be sharp. And often this is not possible with one exposure. So you would have to use very small apertures, so maybe f16, f19. And this would lead to the effect called diffraction, so basically taking away from the overall sharpness of the image. So if you stick with f9.5 or f11, on the other hand, you don't get the complete depth of field. And you just use focus stacking to solve that problem. And I actually have another video on that, which I'll link. So for the next lesson, let's look at this photo here, which is zoomed in from, I think I also took this from Yaki Point, the South Rim. And what this is about, it's about balance. And this shot really, it's unbalanced. So you have the sun here, it's close to the middle. You have very prominent rock features here to the side. And here on the left, there's nothing to balance it. So if you think of some scales, you put a really heavy object on the right side, you have something in the middle, but nothing on the left, the scale would tip to the right. So that's an unbalanced photo. And the lesson is really, you should learn about the rules of composition and also knowing when to break them. But this occasion here, this wasn't the time to break it. Also, I have another photo which is a little wider. So for this photo here, it's very to the left. But as you'll see later in the processed version, I was able to balance it a bit in post by just applying some post-processing techniques. But still, if you think of some scales here, it's very heavy here on this side, and over here, there's a lot of open space. But because it's so much, and also because I have some stones down here and clouds which are later darkened, I made it working, but it's not perfect. So learn the rules, experiment, know when to break them and when not to break them. And judging from my photos here, I was kind of struggling with that. Also, there are actually some very good videos about composition by Adam Gibbs. So if you're not following him, check out his channel. This was some of his recent videos about different compositions, rules, and also when to break those rules. Those are very good, so have a look there. And just as a general rule, which you could always refer to, placing such heavy objects close to the side of the frame seldom works. And as a final tip, let's look at the last photos I took at the Grand Canyon, so last evening. And what you see actually returned to the same spot where I was the evening before. And I think let's look at those photos. Those ones here where I did a lot of experimenting, shooting and different directions. And the lesson is, if you have the chance to plan your trip to be at a place multiple days, that's always good, because then you can return to photo spots. So you can take your time scouting, experimenting with different views, different compositions, and then return and shoot the place in different light. And for example, this evening I think this is one of my best photos I took at the Grand Canyon, also in terms of composition, in terms of light, and you'll later also see the processed version. But yeah, I came back to this viewpoint, which I'm not sure which one it was. Was it Yavapai or Hopi Point? I'm not sure, but this view caught my eye already the days before, and that evening as another storm went through, I went back there, and this time I also got a very good composition, I think. I just left out any foreground because I think I reviewed the photos of the days before and just realized this doesn't work at all. So when I went back, I was prepared. I had done the scouting here, and that's the lesson. So take your time at a place, get to know the place, and only then will you be really able to capture its essence. And you do that by returning multiple times, photographing it in possibly different light, and making sure you get really the best possible result. Okay, so I think you've now seen enough bad photos, also a few good ones. I think it's time to show you the photos which I actually processed, or the final photos. So this one was one of the photos I took the first afternoon. I even did a panoramic here. It's not a really good photo. I don't like this tree intruding on the side, but it shows the expanse of the Grand Canyon, so it's not too bad. And yeah, with some heavier post-processing, I was able to add some drama and some light. This post-processing is actually, it feels a little too heavy now, but yeah, that's what I did back then. This one is the one I was talking about, where I was talking about balance. So as I said, here's a heavy object and the sun's also to this side, but I was able to brighten this a bit, also brighten the foreground here on the left. So this creates a bit of balance here, because this is also very bright as the sun. And then I darkened and brought contrast to those clouds here and also to this area to create also some weight here on this side. And I think this works now. Those photos here I really like, so there are close-ups when the light was breaking through the clouds here. Also this one, this looks very nice, and yeah, I intentionally processed it very dark, and the shape of the clouds here of the light looks just nice. And then here's my favorite photo of that trip, and it's still a favorite of mine. Also, yeah, you could argue that this is also a bit heavy here on this side, but the way the viewer is led through the frame here along this ridge, then here to the light, and then I have the light beams going back into the Grand Canyon here. Also beautiful structured clouds here and the branch hanging in. So it's really a nice photo, I think. And also there's a lot of detail. I mean, as much detail as you could expect from a 10 megapixel camera, but it's one of my favorite photos. Then here's one of the photos where I zoomed in on the Grand Canyon. Here's the processing is a little too heavy in my opinion, too contrasty, but again, I think this is a good composition. So the river snaking through the composition here, and that was a good decision to zoom in. Same for this one. This also no foreground, just here this piece. It's intruding into the frame a bit, but yeah, I darkened it in post so it's not that distracting. And I really like the shape of the cloud. It looks a bit like a heart here, and I further worked on this in post-processing to really focus the view on that area. This photo, yeah, it's not really good, I think. For some reason I really wanted the sun in the frame, and yeah, that's led to a compromise, because now the Grand Canyon really, it's very small. This is competing, so what's the subject here? Is it the sun, there's nothing else, or is it the Grand Canyon? But there's not so much structure, so this is a photo I wouldn't take today. If I would take a photo today, I'd focus more on the Grand Canyon and not try to include the sun no matter what, and I think that's what happened here. This is again one of the photos where this points into the frame. I don't like it very much how it's cut off here, but yeah, this photo is not too bad, and this one here is one of my favorites, the one I showed you at the end. So this is where I came back to this viewpoint and now really got an intentional composition without any distracting elements in the foreground, just focusing here on the Grand Canyon, on the beautiful light that evening. And also the final photo from the trip. Sure, I went to the Horseshoe Bend, which back then there weren't many people, and as I said, I didn't have a wide angle lens, but there was another photographer who also was shooting Canon, and he lent me his I think 10mm lens, and this was perfect to capture this photo. And yeah, I actually like this one. You can't go wrong here at this viewpoint, even in bright daylight. So I hope you liked this little video about some lessons from the past, and yeah, also I hope you found it interesting to see some of my not so good photos. Yeah, I just kept them for reference, although I don't process any of them. But yeah, it's sometimes interesting to just look back a few years and see how you did things back then, what photos you did. And as you saw, even I was able to capture a few photos which are still like 11 years on. So it was really interesting. And if you liked the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed already, subscribe, and see you on the next one. Bye.